At the moment, GenAI feels unstoppable. There's loads of hype, lots of news coverage, loads of new tools coming out all the time. But MIT have released a piece of research recently that suggests there's a slightly different picture emerging. They say that only 5% of GenAI projects translate into real business impact, by which they mean sustained increases in productivity or profitability. That means 95% of projects are never really translating into genuine business impact. 6 months ago, I wrote a blog about this. At that point, there were several surveys that come out, and they showed that between 10 and 50% of projects were successful. So this paints, or MIT's study paints a much bleaker picture. It's based on 300 public statements, which are issued by companies. So that would be PR, press releases, but also 50 interviews with major senior managers within companies and 150 questionnaires to users. They compiled that information, but the methodology they used to analyze it is pretty unclear, which is surprising for an academic institution. So it's quite difficult to tell how valid and reliable their conclusions are. Their success criteria, which I've stated is sustained productivity or profitability increases, are quite strict too. You can have a material business benefit without it necessarily having sustained impact. They're also relying heavily on these public statements, which may be skewing the picture a little bit. So I would take the 95% figure with a bit of a pinch of salt. Nevertheless, the patterns that they identify are worth exploring. They say that it's not a technology problem, it's a people problem primarily. So things like a lack of executive buy-in, low user uptake, overinflated expectations perhaps. But importantly, they also say that it's because often the tools that are being used, the AI tools that are being used, are too generic and not adapted to the enterprise or the context in which they're trying to be used. So they forget context, can't learn from feedback, and don't really fit with how people actually want to work. Nevertheless, adoption is very high. 90% of execs interviewed had trialed AI, but of the 9 sectors that they looked at, only 2 had seen any kind of material structural changes in the way that they worked. MIT identified 4 sort of recurring themes really that come out. The first one is expectation mismatch. So 90% of employees they interviewed use ChatGPT or something similar every day, multiple times a day in their work. Whereas only 40% of the companies interviewed provide those tools. So people are self-empowering. They're privately using these tools without it necessarily being mandated or encouraged by the companies they work for. But that also means that when the tools are provided by the company, they're perhaps not as good or not exactly what they're expecting, or they already feel that they're getting the tools that they need from these commercial generic AI tools. There's also a problem with weak use cases. The successful ones had a very clear business need and driver with a measurable set of success criteria. And from there, they would expand the use cases. So identifying the best use cases is incredibly important. They also found that go-it-alone builds, in-house builds, only got deployed about a third of the time, whereas the companies that were partnering with the vendor or with external expert consultants, that doubled the odds. So around about 60% of initiatives made it to deployment. And then the other problem was to do with fitting into people's natural workflows. If the tool doesn't sit within the way that they want to perform the tasks that they need to do, they're not going to use it. Another interesting area was that they identified that 50% of the spend on these projects was around sales and marketing initiatives. Now, I can kind of see that because it impacts the bottom line most directly, but that's not what I've been seeing out in the wild. And so that may be down to the fact that they're using PR information to derive these conclusions. Companies are less likely to put out a press release about some sort of back office automation. But from that, they argue that the biggest gains are to be had from doing back office automation. things like generating invoices, operational improvements, that sort of thing. So how do you get to the right side of this sort of divide that they've identified? They say buy, don't build wherever possible, but importantly, make sure that you treat the vendors you're working with as business partners, not just software suppliers. Make sure that they understand your business and what you're trying to achieve. Empower the front line, so the people who actually have the problem should be spoken to, allowed to identify problems that can be solved, and allow those people to champion the use cases. Insist on having a learning capability, the ability to fine-tune the model, to adapt it to what you need to do, and make sure that it can identify failures, or you can identify failures and fix them and improve. This is where agentic AI might come in, which will have persistent memory and iterative learning built into it. And also make sure that you measure and collect feedback so that you can understand whether you're making a measurable impact. Final thoughts. MIT's core message is that it's not a technology problem. It's to do with how we apply that technology. It's worth noting that the report came from Project Nanda, which is an initiative to create the sort of next version of the web, which they call agentic web. So they do have some sort of motivation, or they have a solution in mind to the problems that they've identified, shall we say. So sort of factor that in if you read this report. Also, prototypes do fail. It's going to be expected. That's the point of them, to learn and to fail quickly where you need to. But nevertheless, 95% is a large number. So the key points are: choose adaptive learning tools, embed them naturally into the workflow, and build genuine partnerships with vendors and experts to maximize the chance for you to succeed. Thank you.